Welcome to the World Sip. Today we're in Bourbon County, Kentucky. We're here delving deep into all things bourbon. So we've come to the world's most award-winning distillery, Buffalo Trace. The World Sip had an all-access pass with third-generation distillery legend, Freddie Johnson.
My name is Freddie Johnson. I'm a tour guide here at Buffalo Trace Distillery in Frankfort, Kentucky. Buffalo Trace Distillery is the oldest continually operated distillery in the United States. Our story basically is centered around the buffalo and how this distillery came to be, and basically how the settlers came into this area. What we discovered for Buffalo Trace Distillery were sitting right on the original trace or trail of the buffalo through Kentucky. They migrated 4 or 5 abreast of each other, which helps people to understand why the old country roads around Kentucky are 75 to 100 feet wide. Those original buffalo that came through here stood right at 7 feet tall, weighed close to 2,000 pounds, and when they came through as a herd, basically they trampled down everything, and it made it an easy navigation route for the old settlers with their wagons. So they came into this area and discovered it was the perfect place for making whiskey.
The buffalo had clearly heard this was the place to make bourbon. Any other reason?
And the water. The water. We hear so much about the limestone water. This part of central Kentucky sits on a fault in the Earth's crust. And millions of years ago, those plates actually buckled. The force of the shift was so great, it pushed the white marble limestone that we hear so much about from way beneath the earth up to the surface. The reason that the limestone is white is because it came from the bottom of the sea. And so that's why it has a lot of calcium and a lot of minerals in it. And the pH factor of the water is entirely different here than it is in other parts of the country. Going through that white limestone produces an exceptionally sweet taste to the product. It filters out the iron, and when you use your unique yeast strain with it, produces an exceptionally sweet and wonderful flavor to the whiskey.
You hear a lot about the water. You hear a lot about a lot of things.
You hear a lot about the charring of the insides of barrels. What we discovered was the settlers that came out here, originally they were making a whiskey, but they didn't have a container durable enough to handle that transporting of that whiskey down to New Orleans. What was available to them were white oak barrels. Well, white oak lent itself very nicely to handling distilled spirits. They just rinsed the barrels out, put the whiskey into the barrel, floated the barrels down the river to New Orleans. Try to imagine what your whiskey is going to smell and taste like after 5 to 7 months in a hot summer sun after it's been in a dill pickle barrel or a fish herring barrel. So basically it ruined the taste of that whiskey. So the first shipments were actually a disaster. Hence the charring of the insides of white oak barrels was originally done by those settlers to purge that barrel from what had been in the barrel before. Hence the stipulation for bourbon, it has to be a newly charred white oak barrel. That's really how the charring got started. The first whiskey of color was bourbon. It was known as the red whiskey. It helps you to understand the line in a lot of the old cowboy movies where the cowboy would go into the saloon, look at the barkeep, and he'd say, "Give me a shot of red eye." They were asking for bourbon. The other whiskeys were still clear.
Tell me, Freddie, who makes the best red eye in this here town?
It doesn't matter to me who I think makes the best bourbon because the consumer determines what they consider to be the best bourbon. What makes me proud is to be able to tell them that this distillery, last few years, has become the most award-winning distillery in the world. Of the top 5 whiskeys in the world, 3 of those sit at Buffalo Trace Distillery.
So Freddie, how do the locals enjoy their bourbon?
If they start pouring bourbon, you better get ready for some bluegrass and some country music. Everybody knows Kentucky and that music goes together.
We better get our dancing shoes on then.
But first, time for an intense introduction to bourbon. Brace yourself for some knowledge.
White Dog, Everclear, Georgia Moon, White Lightning. This is what goes into the barrel. But we're in the middle of the woods. You don't know me. Word on the street, we make some pretty good hooch. But you don't know me. So we've got to find out if this dog will hunt. So we've got to wake it up.
Okay, cool.
So the obvious question is, Freddie,
Freddie,
how do you wake the dog?
how do you wake the dog?
You slap it. All right, this is how moonshiners found out about the quality of their whiskey before it ever touched their lips.
Yeah.
Cup your hand like this. I'm going to pour some White Dog in your hands. Smell of it. Believe it or not, it's going to smell soft and buttery to the nose.
Look.
Now, I want you to smack your hands together. Pop them. Smack. Rub them real briskly. Cup, smell your hands again.
Oh, you're getting alcohol.
Really strong of alcohol, right? I now know the strength of this whiskey. Got it? Let them breathe. Let them breathe. When I say Hillshire, you say farm. When I say bourbon, you say corn. Smack them again. Rub them real briskly. Cup, smell them again. Corn. What's the dominant grain in bourbon? It's corn. I now know the strength of your whiskey and the dominant grain you've used to make it with. Let them breathe again. Fly, my friend, be free. Let them breathe. Smack them again. Rub them real briskly. Cup, smell them again. They will smell like bread, like yeast.
Wow, Freddie is a magician.
How cool is that?
I don't know how he's doing it.
Yeast is basically the heart of your taste profile. So, you're bad. I know the strength. I know the dominant grain.
Yep.
I know the kind of yeast you use. I can now tell you the proof of your whiskey off the still by the way my hands feel. Notice your hands again. They were feeling tacky, but now they're starting to feel unbelievably smooth.
Yeah, real.
Remember the stipulation for bourbon. Bourbon has to come off the still at a lower proof than whiskey or vodkas or gins. So bourbon cannot come off the still any higher than 160 proof. Most of your really older age bourbons come off at a lower proof, and the reason that you do that is the lower the proof off the still, the more you retain the natural properties from which it was made.
For it to become bourbon, the clear White Dog whiskey needs to be aged in a newly charred white oak barrel.
This goes in. 8 to 9 years later, Middle Floors, this comes out. Same White Dog goes in. 10 to 12 years later, Eagle Rare comes out. So the only difference in these two products is where they set in the warehouse and for how long.
Buffalo Trace make a ton of different whiskies and bourbons, all subtly different in their own way.
Freddie could easily talk about them all day, and we could happily drink them.
But as the bourbon was flowing, we were in the mood for that bluegrass music. And the conversation was getting a little bit off topic.
Hey, I did that one time with a biker. That didn't work out too well. So
We're going to head to Nashville now, drink some more bourbon, and check out some music.
Let's go.
We waved goodbye to Bourbon County, Kentucky, and headed down the road to Nashville, Tennessee, aka Music City.
Hey guys, how you doing?
Good, how are you?
How's it going?
You're doing well. Well, Robbie, welcome to Holland House, Nashville, Tennessee. I can't provide you with any music, but I can provide you with some bourbon and some rye.
Cheers to Holland House.
And cheers to Buffalo Trace.
We've got a couple of gigs to get to.
So we'll see you next time on The World Sip.
After seeing off our Sazeracs, it was safe to say we'd discovered bourbon. All that was left to do now was enjoy the country sounds of Nashville's famous music scene. Let's go.